The Book of Abraham is a book of scripture used by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Joseph Smith claimed that he translated the text from some Egyptian papyri. These papyri were part of a traveling Egyptian collection featuring some mummies and other artifacts. After examining the papyri, Joseph claimed that, with W. Phelps and Oliver Cowdery as scribes, I commenced the translation of some of the characters, or hieroglyphics, and much to our joy found that one of the rolls contained the writings of Abraham, another the writings of Joseph of Egypt. Joseph raised the $2,400 needed in order to buy the collection and began working on the translation of the papyri he claimed contained the writings of Abraham while he was in Egypt, called the Book of Abraham, written by his own hand upon papyrus. Wilford Woodruff recorded that Joseph the seer has presented us some of the Book of Abraham, which was written by his own hand, but hid from the knowledge of man for the last 4,000 years, but is now come to light through the mercy of God. Today, the Church views the Book of Abraham as being a book of modern scripture and publishes it as part of the Pearl of Great Price, which is often bundled with the Book of Mormon and the Doctrine and Covenants. The introduction to the text reads, "The Book of Abraham, translated from the papyrus by Joseph Smith, a translation of some ancient records that have fallen into our hands from the catacombs of Egypt, the writings of Abraham while he was in Egypt, called the Book of Abraham, written by his own hand upon papyrus." There were 3 facsimiles that were part of the scroll. Joseph provided a translation of these images, and they are included as part of the text today. This is Facsimile Number One. According to the Book of Abraham, this is a depiction of an attempted sacrifice of Abraham by the idolatrous priest who had previously sacrificed 3 virgins on the same altar. The text reads, "And it came to pass that the priests laid violence upon me, that they might slay me also, as they did those virgins upon this altar. And that you may have knowledge of this altar, I will refer you to the representation at the commencement of this record." The text refers to this image as being a visual depiction of the story. It is intended to be used as an enhancement of the text. This is Facsimile Number 2. It is called a Hypo Cephalus. These were placed under the heads of the mummies. Joseph translated some of the depictions in this image, but not most of them. The most interesting of the images depicted, Facsimile Number 2, concern the star Kolob, which is nearest to the residence of God and governs the other 15 fixed planets and stars. This is Facsimile Number 3. Joseph said that in this image, Abraham is reasoning upon the principles of astronomy to Pharaoh's court. When Joseph Smith translated the Book of Abraham, there was no one in the Western Hemisphere who could read Egyptian. The Rosetta Stone had been discovered, but that knowledge had not yet crossed the Atlantic. Before the science of Egyptology could advance to the point in America, so that the papyrus could be examined by the scholars, the collection was sold by Emma Smith to a museum in Chicago and then lost in the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. Fortunately, the facsimiles had been copied and published and were available for study. The first study was performed by M. Théodule Duveyrier of the Louvre in Paris. Duveyrier was able to decipher the names and titles of the various Egyptian gods and goddesses, as well as the name of the deceased Egyptian for whom the scroll had originally been prepared. Regarding Facsimile Number 3, he wrote, "The deceased led by Mat into the presence of Osiris. His name is Horus, as can be seen in the prayer which is at the bottom of the picture, and which is addressed to the divinity of the 4 cardinal points." Duveyrier recognized the 3 facsimiles as common Egyptian funerary documents and concluded that Joseph's interpretations of these facsimiles was nonsense. In 1912, Reverend Franklin S. Spalding sent copies of the 3 facsimiles from the Book of Abraham to some of the world's leading scholars of Egyptology. 8 of the scholars responded to Spalding, and they all agreed that Joseph's translations were incorrect. Dr. Arthur Mace, assistant curator at the Department of Egyptian Art of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, said, "The Book of Abraham, it is hardly necessary to say, is a pure fabrication. Cuts 1 and 3 are inaccurate copies of well-known scenes on funeral papyri, and cut 2 is a copy of one of the magical discs, which, in the late Egyptian period, were placed under the head of the mummies. Joseph Smith's interpretations of these cuts is a farrago of nonsense from beginning to end. Egyptian characters can now be read almost as easily as Greek, and 5-minute study in an Egyptian gallery of any museum should be enough to convince any educated man of the clumsiness of the imposture." Dr. James A. Breasted of Haskell Oriental Museum, University of Chicago, stated, "It will be seen, then, that if Joseph Smith could read ancient Egyptian writing, his ability to do so had no connection with the decipherment of hieroglyphics by European scholars. The 3 facsimiles in question represent equipment which will be and has been found in unnumbered thousands of Egyptian graves. Facsimile number 2 represents a little disc, commonly called a Hypo Cephalus. These did not come into use until the late centuries just before the Christian era. They did not appear in any Egyptian burials until after 1,000 years after the time of Abraham. They were unknown in Egypt in Abraham's day. Facsimile number 3. The scene again is depicted innumerable times in the funeral papyri, coffins and tombs, and temple walls of Egypt. No representation of it thus far found in Egypt, though we have thousands of them, dates to earlier than 500 years after Abraham's age. The Egyptologists all agreed that Joseph's interpretations of the facsimiles were incorrect. These were common funeral scenes whose interpretations were well known. They also agreed that facsimiles number 2 and 3 did not exist in Abraham's day, but several centuries later. In 1967, some of the original papyri were discovered in the New York Metropolitan Museum of Art and given to the church. The most interesting of the surviving papyri fragments contain facsimile number 1, and quite a bit of the immediate parts of the scroll that were attached to it. These papyri have been examined and translated by the Egyptologists, the very first examination being commissioned by the church. It has been determined that these papyri are just ordinary funeral texts, the Book of Breathings, or the Book of the Dead, for a man named Horeth. Joseph Smith's Egyptian Alphabet and Grammar was found in the church archives in 1966. This document shows his working attempt to translate the Egyptian characters, including many that are on the recovered papyrus. Examinations show that there is no relation between the characters on the papyrus and Joseph's translation. The church has known about these problems since 1967, when the papyri were recovered and examined. But it still teaches that Joseph translated the papyrus to get the Book of Abraham. Despite being raised in the church and its educational system my whole life, I did not learn about any of these problems until I was confronted by an investigator about it while I was on my mission. The church has responded to these problems by proposing that it may have been taken from a different portion of the papyrus scrolls, or that instead of making a literal translation, he used the Urim and Thummim as a means of receiving revelation. An examination of Joseph Smith's translation document shows the first of these apologetic responses to be invalid. Some of the characters from the recovered papyrus fragments match those in Smith's notes that he attributes to the text, and in the same sequence. Facsimile 1 in the Book of Abraham matches the one on the recovered papyri. So it is evident that the recovered papyrus fragments are part of the scroll used by Joseph as the source of the Book of Abraham. The second fails because the Book of Abraham contains Smith's translation of the facsimiles included in the papyri. Abraham 1:12 specifically references facsimile number 1. If it wasn't a literal translation, then why does the Book of Abraham show these facsimiles? Besides, Joseph himself claimed to use the papyrus scrolls as his source, and that claim is still made in the introduction to the text. Joseph's journal repeatedly mentions the work as a translation of the Egyptian characters. The content of the Book of Abraham is also a problem. Joseph translated figure 5 in facsimile number 2 to be, is called in Egyptian Enish-Goandosh. This is one of the governing planets also, and is said by the Egyptians to be the sun, and to borrow its light from Kolob through the medium of Ke-Vanrash, which is the grand key, or in other words, the governing power, which governs 15 other fixed planets or stars. As also Floes, or the moon, the earth and the sun in their annual revolutions. This planet receives its power through the medium of Kli-Floes, or Ha-Kokau beam, the stars represented by numbers 22 and 23, receiving light from the revolutions of Kolob. Everywhere we can physically test the cosmological claims of the Book of Abraham, we find that they do not match up with what the evidence and proven science has shown us about the universe. There are also many anachronisms in the text. The Chaldeans did not exist until the 9th century BC, over 1,000 years after the time of Abraham. The term Pharaoh was not used until the mid-18th dynasty, which is about 500 years-ish after Abraham. It was never used as a name, it was a title, and it meant great house. It didn't mean king by royal blood, as the Book of Abraham says it did. The evidence suggests that the papyri is not what Joseph and the church claimed them to be. If it was, it would be one of the greatest historical discoveries ever made. All of Judaism, Islam, and Christianity would be studying it, and would have transformed the lives of billions of people. However, no one outside the church takes it seriously, not even the other Mormon sects. What does the failure of Joseph's translation of the Book of Abraham say about his claim to have the gift to translate ancient languages? Since Joseph's translations fail when we can check them, what are we to make of his translations that cannot be checked?